Brothers, here we go again with horror movie. Today, we're diving into another horror movie which name is Smiles. Dr. Rose Cotter is a doctor at a mental hospital, and on this particular day she receives an unusual patient. The woman tells her that she frequently sees figures disguised as different people, all of whom smile at her in an eerie way. Dr. Rose Cotter is shocked because this is the first time she has encountered such a case. The woman then mentions that she saw her grandfather, who had been dead for many years, and that he told her she was going to die today. Believing that the woman is in a serious mental state, Dr. Rose Cotter begins to counsel her. However, the woman collapses and insists that she is perfectly sane, but no one is willing to believe her. Suddenly, she appears to be in shock, dropping to the floor and screaming, "Don't come near me!" Realizing that the situation is getting out of control, Dr. Rose Cotter calls for security, reporting that a patient is having a seizure and needs immediate assistance. But when Dr. Rose Cotter turns around, she sees the woman staring at her with an unsettling, unnatural smile. Dr. Rose Cotter calls out to her, but the woman does not respond. Instead, she picks up a glass teacup, shatters it, and drags the sharp edge across her face and throat, cutting deep until she kills herself, all without blinking. By the time the security guards arrive, the woman has already collapsed lifeless on the floor. After work, Dr. Rose Cotter returns home feeling disturbed, as if a lost soul was following her. She senses an eerie presence, as though someone is watching her from the darkness. Then, in the mirror, she sees a reflection. It's the same woman from earlier, staring at her with that same terrifying, unnatural smile. Trevor, a friend of Dr. Rose Cotter's, rushed to her house. When he saw her drop a cup, he asked what had happened. Dr. Rose Cotter explained that a patient had committed suicide in front of her earlier that day, and that she was terrified. Trevor reassured her, telling her not to be too nervous, and hugged her for a while. After comforting Dr. Rose Cotter, the two of them went to bed. However, Dr. Rose Cotter kept having nightmares about her mother, who had taken her own life by overdosing on pills when Dr. Rose Cotter was just a little girl. She woke up in shock and couldn't fall back asleep, so she put on her headphones and sat down in front of her computer. As she listened to the recorded conversation with the patient from earlier, she kept replaying it in a loop. During a brief pause, she suddenly heard strange noises. This time, it was a man's voice, rough and deep, calling out her name. The next day, Dr. Rose Cotter looked up the woman's personal information and discovered that a week before her death she had witnessed another suicide. A professor from their school had bludgeoned himself to death with a hammer in front of her, all while maintaining a twisted smile. It was a gruesome scene. Just then, Dr. Rose Cotter's phone rang. It was her sister, inviting her to dinner for her nephew's birthday the next day. As she spoke on the phone, she casually pulled open the curtains. But at the bottom of the stairs, she saw a man standing there, the same figure she had seen the day before. The sight of him sent chills down her spine, and she quickly backed away from the window. As she hurried through the hallway, she passed a ward and noticed a patient sitting on a bed, laughing uncontrollably. No matter what sound she made, the patient didn't react at all. Feeling uneasy, Dr. Rose Cotter called for security to restrain him. But when the guards arrived and checked, they found no one there, just Dr. Rose Cotter herself, staring back at them. The hallucinations started soon after Dr. Rose Cotter was called by her supervisor. He informed her that the patient had been to their hospital more than a dozen times, but had never displayed aggressive or unusual behavior. Concerned that the previous day's incident had caused Dr. Rose Cotter significant psychological distress, the supervisor advised her to take a week off to rest. On her way home, she bought a toy for her nephew, his favorite plaything. The boy immediately grabbed a small yellow box, recognizing it as the toy train Dr. Rose Cotter had bought for him. However, the moment he opened the box, his expression froze. Sensing something was wrong, Dr. Rose Cotter quickly asked him. Dr. Rose Cotter was stunned. The boy hesitated, completely speechless, then pulled out the lifeless body of a cat. At that moment, Dr. Rose Cotter caught sight of a familiar, eerie smile in the crowd. But to her shock, no one else seemed to see it. Instead, the people around her stared at her like she was insane. Her sister, worried about Dr. Rose Cotter's mental state, took her back to the hospital. Trevor also rushed over, but Dr. Rose Cotter's fiery-tempered sister stopped him at the door, scolding him loudly before driving Dr. Rose Cotter home. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Dr. Rose Cotter confided in Trevor, telling him that she had been seeing ghosts, specifically, the woman who had died in front of her. She insisted that the woman was haunting her, smiling at her, and that this was the same entity that had driven the master's student to death. However, Trevor refused to believe her. Annoyed, he dismissed her words as nonsense, convinced that the stress of her job had made her mentally unstable. "Your mother had a mental illness too," he said coldly. "Are you sure you didn't inherit it from her?" His words stung. Dr. Rose Cotter was left hurt and angry as Trevor stormed off, but just as she continued her research, a sudden, unsettling Dr. Rose Cotter heard someone calling her from the closet next door. The voice sounded exactly like her mother's, repeatedly urging her to come closer. Terrified, Dr. Rose Cotter quickly turned off the lights and lay down on her bed, trying to ignore it. But then, in the dim light, she noticed a mirror placed in the corner of the closet. Reflected in the glass, she saw her mother stepping out of the closet. By early morning, Dr. Rose Cotter decided to investigate further. Using her master's degree research skills, she looked into the professor's background. She discovered that he had started behaving strangely during a lecture, growing paranoid, screaming, and obsessively drawing disturbing images. Every sketch depicted a man laughing. At that moment, the professor's wife shared an eerie story. She revealed that the professor had witnessed a suicide. For more details, the woman had gouged out her own eyes trying to get answers, doctor. But when Rose Cotter turned to her ex-boyfriend, Joel, who was a police officer, she asked him to help investigate the series of deaths. Joel, who still had feelings for Dr. Rose Cotter, committed suicide on the day of the professor's death, uncovered a crucial piece of information. Of the incident existed, so linked to another suicide what had really happened. Police investigation. The footage showed Laura Weaver sleeping at a bus stop when a strange man suddenly approached him. The man stood motionless, staring at Laura Weaver for a long time. Then, without warning, he sat down inside a nearby car, picked up a large pair of scissors and, without saying a word, stabbed himself in the chest. At the same time, Rose Cotter made a shocking discovery. A key clue was that the man was smiling while holding the scissors. This series of discoveries made Dr. Rose Cotter feel numb with shock. She asked Joel to call from Damon's factory to inform her immediately if he uncovered any cases that had been occurring frequently. That evening, Dr. Rose Cotter received tracked a total of 20 cases with 19 victims, all of whom were directly connected. However, what stood out the most was that one person had survived, an accountant. At first, the accountant's colleague had committed suicide in front of him. 4 days later, the accountant killed a complete stranger in front of another witness. After that, he was the only survivor, but the curse transferred to the new witness. Determined to get answers, Dr. Rose Cotter and Rose Cotter went to a prison where the accountant was being held. Rose Cotter pretended to be a psychiatrist and told the accountant that he had a patient who had witnessed a suicide 4 days ago and was now seeing strange things. Upon hearing this, the accountant became visibly shaken, holding his head in his hands. He hesitated before speaking again, then looked up and said, "Tell the police to leave first and I'll explain everything." Once they were alone, the accountant revealed the horrifying truth. This was a curse. A few years ago, in Brazil, a man had managed to escape it. The only way was to pass it on by committing murder. The man had killed his neighbor in front of a witness, and as a result, the curse transferred to that witness. From there, it spread further. The accountant explained that the curse thrived on violence and bloodshed. The only way to escape it was to kill someone in front of another person, ensuring that the curse transferred to them. The bloodier and more gruesome the act, the stronger the transfer. Dr. Rose Cotter was horrified. She had no intention of killing anyone, but she needed to find another way to break the curse. She returned home, searching for alternative remedies. At that moment, a woman approached Dr. Rose Cotter. It was the psychiatrist that Blackie had arranged for her. Dr. Rose Cotter invited her inside, desperate for someone to believe her. Then suddenly, the phone next to the door rang. Dr. Rose standing in front of her. Terrified, she dropped the phone, and when the other end of the line was the psychiatrist across from her had changed. "I've been trying to reach you all morning, but you never answered." Into a familiar Dr. Rose Cotter's blood ran cold. She spoke. "If the psychiatrist was on the phone, if you don't kill someone, I will kill you." Panic took hold of Dr. Rose Cotter. With no other options, she grabbed a pocket knife and rushed to the hospital. She entered a patient's room, and as the patient turned to look at her, she hesitated. When Dame arrived, she immediately became frightened, and the sound of her voice quickly attracted the supervisor, Dr. Morgan Desai, who asked Dame what she was doing there. Dame didn't respond to what he said, but she took a knife out of her pocket and, without saying a word, stabbed the patient in the heart. Dame was just dreaming, and she suddenly realized what had happened. She hurriedly called Joel to tell him that since the curse was transmitted from person to person, it wouldn't spread if she hid in a deserted place. Dame decided to face the demon alone and destroy it. She was only 10 years old when her mother was in the room where she swallowed the food. After that, Dame pushed open the door to her mother's room, but inside called out Dame's name, asking her to call for help, but Dame shook her head in fear and ran out of the room. When she heard a strange sound cross-carding from her mother's room, Dame hurriedly grabbed the lamp and went over to check on her mother, who was alive and sitting on the bed, crying.
Her eyes
At first, mother and daughter exchanged harsh words, but soon her mother's tone suddenly changed, and she blamed Dame for not calling an ambulance to save her. Dame said that she was just a child and had been very afraid of what was happening, but her mother did not intend to forgive her. At the end of the movie, Dr. Rose Cotter shows that eerie smile and realizes what it means, so she quickly closes the door and runs formed into an 8-foot-tall monster and is rushing toward her. In the heat of the moment, Dr. Rose Cotter smashes the oil lamp on the monster's head, and the fire spreads across its entire body, burning it to death. Seizing the opportunities away, Dr. Rose Cotter opens the door and realizes that her mother has transformed. But has the curse and the burden on her heart really been lifted? Dr. Rose Cotter arrives at Joel's house and expresses her gratitude, saying, "I'm thankful to you for helping me out and saving me." She admits that she is still very scared after everything she has been through, and asks Joel to spend more time with her in the evenings. Suddenly the light goes out, and with the darkness, Joel reveals a strange smile. She can't see anyone, only decides to check on her. But when Dame sees him, she mistakes him for that grinning monster and runs wildly back into the house, locking the door behind her. Just then, the 8-foot monster bursts out of the house. Then does she realize that she is still in the old house she had never left. At that moment, Joel drives up, worried about her, tears off its face and slips right through Dame's mouth. When Joel finally opens the door, he sees Dame staring at him with a twisted grimace, her body drenched in gasoline. He watches in horror as she lights a dagger in her hand and sets herself ablaze. Joel starts banging on the door, but it's too late. The monster